has been brought to you by the letter G.
So now we're up to G, and G is a very, very happy topic for archaeologists because G stands for geophysics. And geophysics is pretty much every archaeologist's best friend and has therefore been incorporated into our standard practice.
So we get geophysics started early.
Geophysics, well, that's just what our geophysics team can do.
Geophysical survey will be...
The geomagnetic apparatus is so heavy it has to be towed by a vehicle.
And actually, this has been very much on my mind recently because just last week I saw a talk by Dr. John Gator, who was the resident geophysicist on Time Team, my very favorite archaeology TV shows, and actually perhaps one of my favorite TV shows, which had a long run on TV from 1994 to 2014. 20 years, so a lot of other people liked it too. And it's actually recently come back in the form of a YouTube show in 2022, but with a lot of the original cast. I myself also did some geophysics last summer at an Iron Age site in Dorset. That there in the picture is ground penetrating radar or GPR, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Anyway, so what is geophysics? Geophysics is a number of imaging techniques that we can use to get a sense of what's underneath the ground before we dig anything. And this, in many cases, allows us to better target our digs or allows us to avoid digging overall. Now, I know what you're thinking. Avoid digging? You're an archaeologist. Isn't that what archaeologists do? And the answer is not really, and it's actually a good thing. Let me explain. First, by its very nature, digging is very hit or miss. You might find what you're looking for, but very often you find nothing. And that actually gets very expensive and very time-consuming.
What are you talking about, buddy? The phone lines are over there! What did I say to you? Your phone lines are over there! Hey! What did I say? How many times?
Hey! It's a waste of resources in an industry that is starving for resources. Second, you may not get to dig at all. Maybe what you want to dig is on some landowner's site, and that person is fine with you to do a survey with geophysics, but not to dig. Or maybe you're in an area where for some reason it's unsafe to dig. In these cases, the geophysics survey can often tell you what you need to know. But third and most importantly is that digging is destructive. And a lot of people forget that. And for this reason, many archaeologists are reluctant to dig, even when they can, because they know they're going to be destroying some of the very same evidence and information that they're looking for. Remember, archaeology is ultimately about information, not treasure. So our latest scientific techniques, as cool and high-tech as they are imperfect, and they miss stuff. So there's always the thought that if you wait to dig this and dig later when the techniques and technology improve, not as many things will slip through the cracks. A good example of this actually is the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, a Chinese emperor, and he's very famous because all those terracotta warriors, the terracotta army, was guarding his tomb. Well, to this day, even though the terracotta warriors are mostly exposed, his tomb is not. Why is that? Well, those terracotta warriors used to be painted, but that paint, as often is the case in ancient sites, does not or did not survive the initial contact with the environment, and much of it faded off right away. So what they're trying to work on is how can they open up the tomb without destroying some of the paint and colors that will likely be in there. Anyway, yeah, so digging, not always a good thing. Now, when did geophysics first start? Well, a lot of people don't know this, but it began with a technique called bozing as early as the 1800s. And the first, I think, famous example of this comes from Lieutenant General Augustus Pitt Rivers, which is just a boss name, by the way, who was basically the father of modern archaeology in Britain. And he used this at a place called Cranbourne Chase. Now, what bozing essentially involves is hitting the earth with like a hammer or a cane, and listening to the sound. A hollow sound represents something like a ditch or a pit, something less dense or even hollow. A sharper sound will indicate the presence of something solid, so like a wall. And you go around and hit the earth and listen for the different changes in sound. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy and super low tech, but it actually seems to have worked pretty well. And actually, the technique, though not called as such, had been used a few decades earlier, and this is documented in central Sweden by an archaeologist called Hjalmar Stolpe. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but anyway, at a Viking site where he apparently hit the ground with a hammer to hear for the hollow of Viking-era graves. And once again, it apparently worked to great effect. But the first big test came in colonial Williamsburg, still a great place to visit, which I recommend, by the way. And that was in 1938. It was by a gentleman called Mark Malamfy, who, at the behest of a local historian, used it, and this was an electric technique, which we'll discuss later, to find a supposed vault that was in an old churchyard, apparently which contained a bunch of old documents, I think from the 17th or 18th centuries. Well, he did try it out, and his findings indicated there was a vault, but unfortunately, when they dug later, they didn't find anything. However, it was still a good learning experience, and it was later when they went back and analyzed his results that they kind of understood where he went wrong. So even though they didn't find what they were looking for, we can still see this as a success. It was a learning experience. And believe it or not, Mark Malamfy worked for a certain Hans Lundeberg, another Swede, who was pioneering this technique in many different applications, including warfare, even from a hot air balloon. So I guess this is something the Swedes are really good at, in addition to smorgasbords and Viking raids. Then, in the 1950s, Martin Aitken used the technique magnetometry, another form of geophysics, to survey some structures at the settlement of Verulamium, which is underneath St. Albans, the modern city of St. Albans in England today. And Verulamium was a big Roman center or city. Now, this produced some groundbreaking. Well, it didn't actually break the ground, that was kind of the point, but he produced some amazing imagery that actually held up over time. It seems like the technology didn't come into wide use until about the 1990s, but I'll have to ask a real archaeological veteran about that. When it was featured on Time Team, and I think it was the very first episode, when they were investigating Athelney, which is a very famous site associated with King Alfred the Great, if you've ever heard of him.
The geophysics team are now working on the Abbey site, looking for traces of Alfred's Abbey.
And at the time, this caused quite a sensation, because I think it was the first time that really a general public realized that we could kind of see under the ground without actually digging. And from there, it just seems to have exploded. Now, granted, this doesn't cover like stuff with drones or LiDAR or satellites or any of that stuff. We're restricting ourselves to ground-based techniques using electromagnetic equipment. And there are three main kinds of this that I'm going to discuss today. Now, technology is not my strong suit, and we don't have enough time to go too in-depth into everything. So I'm just going to go pretty basic level and tell you the pros and the cons and when it might be good to use these. The first technique is earth resistance, which, crudely speaking, basically involves shooting some electricity down into the ground. And what do we know about electricity? Well, there are certain things that conduct it very well and others that don't. And one of the things that conducts it very well is water. And one of the things that conducts it even better is salt water. So you shoot this electricity into the ground and you measure where the resistance is higher or lower. So wetter areas are going to show a lower resistance because they're good conductors. And what do we know about wetter areas? Well, that would be in things like pits and ditches where water would collect. And of course, water tends to contain salt, soil contains salt, and that often, will affect the resistivity. Now, other things that are drier, like walls, will have a higher resistance because they're not as conductive of the electricity. So using those differences in resistance, you can actually create a graphic, an image, that shows you where the points of high resistivity are, which might be structures, and the very low resistivity, which it might be pits or ditches. This is the earliest, modern, and simplest method, but it does have its ups and downs. So, for example, it is rather slow. You have to walk and stick these sensors into the ground at even intervals, and that actually takes quite some time. It also tends to work better on flat as opposed to hilly or slanted or uneven ground. Also, certain types of soil are conductive, and it doesn't work as well in those because you get a lot of noise. So, for example, sandy soil is usually good. Clay soil, not so much. And as an aside, I can tell you it's an absolute dig in. It's dense and heavy, it traps water, and is just very difficult to work with. So yeah, nightmare. Next, we have magnetometry. Magnetometry, which was used by Aiken at Verulamium, works by measuring local variations in the Earth's magnetic field.
There is a great disturbance in the force.
And this is caused by three main things: presence of iron, presence of burnt stuff, and presence of organics. So as we know, organics would tend to collect in pits and ditches, so it's good at finding those, and for kilns, because we'll have burning there and another particular reason. Well, why is that? First, iron is magnetic. Secondly, burning actually demagnetizes magnetic oxides, which then as they cool and firm up again, remagnetize in line with the Earth's field. So this would help you find things like hearths and bricks that happens to, clays that are baked, which is basically ancient kilns. And finally, this is a little bit weird, but the bacteria that break down rotting organic matter, these actually magnetize things at a low level. So that will give you some feedback as well. This is generally faster as you don't need to stick anything to the ground, and you can even go on wheels. Finally, there's ground penetrating radar, or GPR, which is generally the most sort of advanced but also expensive kind. Now, this was a big jump forward because it's probably the only kind of geophysics that's really feasible in an urban environment where you have a lot of metals and concrete and other surfaces, which will really throw off all of the signals in earth resistance and magnetometry. Now, of all these three methods, this is the one you probably understand intuitively the most. Just like any radar, it works by shooting off radio waves, and based on the distance and timing of the bounce back and the changes of frequency of the radio waves, that can sort of identify objects of different densities in your field. But like I said, it is the most expensive method, and actually the data processing and analysis take the most time. They're the most complex. But on the other hand, it does give you a 3D image, which the other types don't. It also tends to be used more in America than in other places. Now, the kind of soil and terrain you're using it on also matters. It tends to work well in very uniform soils like a sand. However, very soft soils like clay or silty soil, it doesn't work as well in. I believe this is the reason for this is that those are soft kinds of soils and they tend to absorb rather than bounce back those radio waves. But somebody can fact check me on that. Also, in very heterogeneous or rocky soils, the signals tend to get scattered and that creates a lot of noise, so it doesn't work there as well. So yes, it may be the most fancy, but it also has its downsides. So as you can see, there are positives and negatives to each method. Depends on the time and budget constraints you're working with, what type of environment you're in, etc. So they all have their uses in different contexts. Now, they also produce different types of images. These by default will be black and white, but you can colorize them, which is very useful. And you can overlay them on top of satellite imagery, LiDAR, and this creates really a multi-layered map that is sort of super useful and very standard today in big scale surveys and archaeology projects. And this is called GIS, Geographic Information Systems. Very cool, something that I have a little bit of difficulty producing myself, but are very, very useful in your work. It's definitely not as simple to decide which method to use and how to interpret the results as TV often makes it look. I remember in his talk, Dr. Gator mentioned these clean lines that they found and right angles that they were sure were some kind of Saxon building. Well, they turned out to be an old soccer pitch. So yeah, that kind of stuff happens all the time in the world of geophysics. However, all in all, geophysics is a very happy subject for archaeologists that we love to talk about. Audiences like to see it, and it's a lot of fun. So there you have it, G for geophysics. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.